Everybody got your mic on? The Havre Grace Planning Commission special workshop for July the 11th, 2023 will now come to order. And I'll call the roll. Chip, please.
Here.
Warren Hartenstein is absent. Chair Volney Ford is present. Councilwoman Tamish Nagus.
Here.
Ed Gorono is absent. Farhat Shah is absent. Janice Chan.
Here.
Okay. And we have a quorum. And we haven't yet appointed another commissioner, have we? Okay, I haven't seen anything.
Tim's been on vacation too, back at the end of this week.
Okay. Okay. Okay, tonight being a workshop is open to the public, but we're not, to my knowledge, not voting on anything, taking any voting action tonight. We're just here to continue our work in developing the comprehensive plan. So, we'll start with your presentation.
Okay, great. Hello. Hello, commissioners.
Eric Lawrence. Go ahead.
Eric Lawrence, the associate city planner with the city of Havre Grace.
Okay.
Hello, commissioners. And
You might want to pull that a
listening.
little closer to you.
Today we're going to go over the sensitive areas, environmental resource and protection. We have a brief presentation for you. So I'd like to get started by, this is our sixth work session. We are about halfway through our comprehensive plan today. Is about the halfway, so congratulations, everyone. That was a big feat. So we have the, several of the chapters already completed, and we received the action items. We will get back to you that at a later date. But today we're going to focus on some exciting topic, the environmental resources in sensitive areas. Now, to provide a brief background, the Economic Growth, Resource and Protection and Planning Act of 1992 requires local governments to incorporate an environmental resource in sensitive areas element in the comprehensive plan. The sensitive areas element sets the goals, objectives, principles, policies, and standards to protect sensitive areas from the adverse effects of development. A complete list will be provided shortly. In addition to these sensitive areas that are included in Volume 1 and 2 are the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area from 1984 and the Forest Conservation Act, which was initially adopted along with 1992 and our latest draft in 2012. As stated, one of the challenges posed by the Act is to develop environmental protection policies within the plan in designated growth areas. Any conflict that may arise between the sensitive areas and protection and development should be based on the comprehensive plan. Again, as stated, these are what's included in the sensitive areas element in both Volume 1 and 2 of the Models and Guidelines. Now, the sensitive areas that were adopted according to Volume 1 and 2 are in line with the state of Maryland's planning visions. Now, several of them are addressing, which would be the first one, would be the quality of life and sustainability. A high quality of life is achieved through universal stewardship of the land, water, and air, resulting in sustainable communities and protection of the environment. And one of the 9 vision is environmental protection. So the land, water, resource, including the Chesapeake and coastal bays, are carefully managed to restore and maintain a healthy air and water, natural systems, and living resources. And then also number 10, resource conservation, which is the waterways, forests, agricultural areas, open space, natural systems, and scenic areas are conserved. Now 11, stewardship, government, business entities, and residents are responsible are all responsible for the creation of sustainable communities by collaborating to balance efficient growth with resource protection. That's a lot. And all of those ideas and visions are going to be inherent throughout the environmental resource chapter. It's not a one-for-one, but rather it's supposed to be, embedded within the overall actions, goals, and objectives. Now, we synthesized Volume 1 down to streams, wetlands, and their buffers, 100-year floodplains and floodways, the habitat areas, which may include the threatened and endangered species, and then steep slopes. And then Volume 2 is the tidal and non-tidal wetlands, the forest conservation, and then landscape conservation, which will be including scenic vistas and cultural landscapes. And then we have the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area Act in addition to the eroding shorelines. The Chesapeake Bay Critical Area Act is a supplemental to the Volume 2. So these 9 sensitive areas can be vulnerable to adverse impacts from development, activities, residential uses, and certain types of land use. Now, what is the city doing to protect these sensitive areas? The development regulations have been adopted by the city, including site plan review, subdivision regulations, forest conservation, sustainable landscaping, stormwater management, among other federal and state policies to regulate development in relation to environmental resources and other areas the city deems of significant importance. This is to improve opportunities for targeted planned flexible development and innovative environmental site design and conservation practices while providing the public with equitable access to environmental resources for generations to come without compromising the integrity of each environmental asset within the city. That's pretty good. So, to getting started, this would be number 0. It's not included in the Volume 1 or 2, but it outlines the watershed boundaries. The lower Susquehanna, which would be this one on the right side, is basically, there's a fault line here where all the water from Lily Run drains up into the lower Susquehanna River watershed. It's approximately 1,917 acres. And then on the west side of that, or the south side, southwest, is the Swan Creek, which runs up here along with Gashies Creek. It's about 1,851 acres. Just to provide you with some sort of context to how the water works within the city as a whole. Now, this brings us to number 1, our streams, wetlands, and their buffers. Now, all waterways within the city have a 25-foot buffer to protect the steep riverine slopes from highly erodible soils and habitats. The Maryland Department of Environment, along with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, coordinate to put these efforts within the city. Regulations. Since January 1st, the Maryland National Wetlands Protection Act has required a state non-tidal wetlands permit or a letter of authorization from the non-tidal wetlands divisions for activities in a non-tidal wetland or within a 25-foot non-tidal wetland buffer, or a 100-foot non-tidal wetland expanded buffer. Within the city, we only account for the 25-foot buffer for both the wetlands, streams, and rivers. Number 2, the floodplain, the 100-year floodplain, which you will see in the lighter blue, are adjacent to all the streams, rivers, and lakes within the Chesapeake Bay. Now, this is regulated by FEMA. The FEMA is a Federal Emergency Management Association. It is a federal plain management, is a community-based effort to prevent flooding or reduce the risk of flooding, resulting in a more resilient community. Now, the city uses the FEMA's tools, the FERA maps, and resources to help communicate and navigate the National Flood Insurance Program requirements and implement higher standards of floodplain management through these state and federal agencies. The city of Havre, along with the property owners, have a role in reducing flood risk and helping communities become more resilient. In addition to the FEMA the city engaging into the NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program. The city also voluntarily partakes in the community rating system, which is a voluntary incentive program that recognizes and encourages community floodplain management practices that exceed the minimum requirements in the NFIP program. For example, they reduce and avoid flood damage to insurable property, they strengthen and support the insurance aspects of the National Flood Insurance Program, and they foster comprehensive floodplain management. In addition to that, the city puts on an additional 2 feet on the base flood elevation of all projects and development within the city. That's a part of that. Our city is currently rated CRS number 7, which provides a 15% discount to all residents, which is pretty cool. Now we have the habitat areas. One of the habitat areas we're going to be looking at is the submerged aquatic vegetation, the SAVs, which provide valuable habitat all along the coastal region here, waterfront. The waterfowl habitat, colonial nesty birds, the great blue heron is a primary bird of concern, and then anadromous fish species, which are along the Susquehanna River. The Upper Chesapeake Bay is historically famous for being part of the Atlantic Flyway. Now, part of this is within this area along here is several forest conservation critical area and habitat areas that all partake within this zone.
Do you all have that?
I don't have that.
No, none of us have that particular map.
Oh, that's fine. They can.
There's not a map that was created for that. There's an illustration, Vim's.
But it's not in this package?
No,
Okay,
it's not.
all right. Okay. We were doing good till we got to that one.
Okay.
Sometimes habitats aren't mapped specifically because of like rare, threatened, and endangered species. They don't want them identified on the map because people go in and rate them.
I see.
So there actually is a reference for habitat generalized
Okay.
areas. That's going to be an electronic sort of link, but we're not going to actually map habitats.
Okay,
Okay, you got that?
I understand.
Okay, good. Brings us to the next one, number 4, steep slopes. Slopes of 15% are rated according to the critical area law from the Chesapeake Bay critical area, but we're going to be focusing on primarily the 25% slopes, which are regulated under the Forest Conservation Ordinance. Slopes of 25% or greater incline are susceptible to erosion and may provide valuable habitat for both plants and wildlife. Avoiding steep slopes is to better fit buildings and roads to the natural topography of the site, so they require minimal grading and disturbance. As you can see on the map, the red would be the most steep, would be over 40%. The orange and yellow would be around 20 to 30%. Most of it is focused on the west side of 40, which would be the Piedmont region, and then the coastal plains on the east side of 40, down to the Chesapeake Bay, where it's relatively flat. And then here we have a diagram between what was existing in 1986 and what is currently existing as of 2021. There was a net loss of 428 acres of forest coverage, which makes us go from about 1,465 acres down to 1,037 acres. Now, it's important to identify where areas of the city can enhance its application of the Forest Conservation Ordinance in relation to development that's occurring. So we have landscape conservation, which is a master title that we put together that would incorporate scenic vistas throughout the city, wildlife corridors, riparian zone corridors, and cultural landscapes. This is a photo that was taken up on the Legacies property. It sits at about 400 feet above base flood elevation and provides a really scenic vista down across the city of Havre de Grace downtown and to the waterfront.
That's Scion Hill, right, Eric?
Scion Hill Estates area, yeah, it would be north of Scion Hill Estates.
That
Right.
particular subdivision, but this is part of the Scion Hill
This would be
concept plan.
It's part of the yes, the single concept plan.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, the next one. Number 8. The Chesapeake Bay Critical Area, which is, it's a Chesapeake Bay Critical Area contains 2 identifications. One are resource conservation, which is the RCA, and then the other is intensely developed area, which is the IDA. The IDA is about 80% of the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area within the city. The RCA is 20%. The IDA is where development may be allowed if certain restrictions are followed. However, in the RCA, development is relatively prohibited because it intrudes on the conservation of the environmental resources and habitats that are currently existing there. The main focus within the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area is to focus on improving the water quality and protecting the habitat that's already existing. We do this through our Chesapeake Bay Critical Area Ordinance. We also have a 10% mitigation standard where development that occurs within the Chesapeake Bay, home property owners are required to provide 10% mitigation of the pre-development water runoff. So it has to be improved to 10% better pre-development conditions. Any questions?
Is that if possible? I mean, suppose the water's already pretty good. Is it within like a range? You know what I'm saying? Like when the water quality, when they come in, if it's already pretty good quality.
Yeah, well, we're focusing mostly on stormwater that
The
falls,
runoff.
and we're trying to capture it through the use of
I
trees
get
and
what you're
shrubs and vegetation and keeping it on site rather than, say, creating a parking lot and having it run straight into the Chesapeake Bay.
I get what you're saying.
So you want to contain all the water that falls on each site and stay on that site and providing.
So you're dealing not only with parking lots, you're dealing with any impervious surface, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so rooftops, everything.
Yes,
All right, so the idea is to improve all of those collectively by 10%. Is that right?
yes.
Okay. And to Janice's question, or to her point, if you've got one property that's doing a fantastic job, 2 properties side by side, they both have the same square footage of imperviousness, and one is already doing a much better job of its water quality than the other. Or the opposite statement would be one has poor runoff quality and the other one has better, but they both have the same square footage. Are they then both expected to get better by 10%?
According to the Chesapeake Bay critical area, the 10% rule is for the stormwater management within the critical area. Yes, they're both supposed to meet certain requirements for planting vegetations and vegetation, primarily trees and shrubs.
But I'm still confused as to, yeah, yeah.
Just to be clear, the 10% rule is applied when people go to redevelop or develop. It has to do with during development. It's not for static properties that are there and,
Okay.
and in place already. It's when you go to redevelop or new development on a site, then it has to meet the 10% rule for stormwater management in the
But no
critical
matter,
area.
regardless of what their current baseline of,
Correct. Yeah, and it has to do with, it's a whole bunch of calculations.
Yeah.
It's a while to watch the process as far as the sheets that they have to fill out to meet that obligation. It has to do with a 10% rule for phosphorus reduction. So it's all measured, and they assume that if you're capturing the phosphorus, you're capturing the other nutrients as well.
and what constitutes redevelopment?
Gosh, I forget the calculations. It has to do with the percentage of what's already, impervious on the site. I can't answer that off
But
the top of my
it
head.
doesn't necessarily have to do with changing the use of a property.
No, it has to do when you go in for development, how much impervious surface is already
Okay.
on the site.
But I guess what I'm saying is if
Characterized.
you decided to go in, let's say they took the hospital and tore it to the ground, and there's nothing but a field of dirt, and they're going to start over with a new facility.
Right.
Is that what you would call redevelopment?
Absolutely. That is outside the critical area. There
I
might be
mean,
some.
if it was
yeah,
inside,
Yeah, but
yeah.
as, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that would absolutely be redevelopment.
Okay, even though there was a use there before that was impervious.
Correct. That's why
Okay.
it would be redevelopment.
Okay, all right.
So,
I'm just want to,
Yeah.
I'm not taking issue with,
yeah,
not taking
not
issue
gotten in
with
the
that
weeds.
policy. I'm just wondering how it derives. That's all.
no, happy to answer the questions that we can. As far as
Okay.
that, I don't mean to take his, take the attention
That's all right.
away.
He needs to catch his breath. Good. Okay.
But I
thank you.
figured he was not going to be able to answer some of those as far as getting in the
Thanks.
weeds.
Thanks.
Yep.
You're on again.
Okay, great, thank you. That brings us to number 9, our last one, which is within the critical area, coastal bays, all along the Chesapeake Bay, is the eroding shoreline. The city has approximately 3 miles of shoreline within the city, and approximately half a mile of shoreline, living shoreline projects have currently been completed. That's pretty incredible. We got a lot of them happening down here. We're in Tidings Park and Concord Point Park, and then we have them up here at the Water Street, and then there's some other more stormwater management practices that are happening. This is an ongoing effort that the city is committed to.
Now, a question. Again, this must get into some pretty arcane definitions, but Havre de Grace historically had a very differently defined shoreline.
Okay.
And historically, there was an enormous amount of infill. People were trying to create land along the water, so they would just come and dump everything under the sun in there to try to, if you will, straighten out the shoreline to make it more suitable for whatever their commercial uses were, and totally without regard to the damage it might do to the environment. And this is, it's all of its early history and all the way up into the 20th century, well into the 20th century. So when you define shoreline erosion, are you defining the loss of what you might call original shoreline soil, or are you talking about the loss of infill? Because infill would be easily eroded, if you understand what I'm saying. I mean, if somebody just dumped a bunch of junk in there, or poor soil, or whatever, stuff that never was there naturally,
Historically,
yeah, it would tend to, it would seem to me, it would tend to wash out more quickly. So I wonder how you want to attack that one?
I think I understand your question. In a lot of cases, we bulkheaded, and we created land. As you know, we can actually go back to historic maps and see where we've extended the shoreline extensively, when you were allowed to create land and bulkhead up until probably like the 1960s. So those areas are in many ways stable because of bulkheading, for instance, or revetments, and there are very few areas that may be in a natural condition in Havre de Grace. So I'm not sure, as far as if that answers your question, what you're...
Well, I guess let's go to the points of erosion that we've identified. What's the characteristic of those places?
Well, actually, like the Water Street project was a replacement where we were actually replacing and refacing bulkheaded areas in that area. That was largely industrial use up until recently. So you're actually doing shoreline improvements there,
Okay.
and facing the past bulkhead condition. I mean, there's steel under there, there's concrete, and there's all sorts of different materials as far as wood, and so it's a combination. So there are living shorelines for the erosion aspect, but there's also for the environmental enhancement aspect. And this map does not exist in your packet, just so you know.
Yeah.
That map will actually be in the water resources element, where we address the whole living shoreline aspect of of the city's effort more fully as required in that chapter.
Well, I think
So-
and what you're telling us is appreciated. I think it's important to know what it is we're saving and why, and that's really where my question is going. It's what is the negative effect of it? And I can think of some things. I can certainly think of siltation in the bay and in the mouth of the river. And I can certainly think of just loss of habitat, things like that, both of which are very important. But thank you.
Sure, no problem. In the south end of town where that big enhancement, it was actually 3-phase enhancement, was very much a living shoreline extension and a habitat enhancement.
Right.
All of them are, so,
Thanks.
no problem.
Thank you. So the overall main idea of this chapter is the environmental resource and sensitive areas element reflects the conviction that both economic growth and resource protection are best accomplished if planning and regulation are coordinated and consistent with each other and are responsive to the visions of the city.
So I have a couple questions.
Okay.
I was reading this earlier today, and my first question is, at one of our recent meetings, we were talking about the sustainability and some of the various other things, and it kind of seems like this is a chunk that can be addressed with something that Volney had shared about possibly having a jetty to come in. And this is regarding on page 3. It says safeguarding, somewhere right in the middle, it says safeguarding the many natural functions performed by floodplains, benefits adjoining and downstream communities. And this is one of the questions I have. Has anybody ever done a study on possibly having a way to protect the city from these floods? I was watching a stream of pictures that came across on somebody's historic page, and they showed the flood of 1972, I believe it was, with Hurricane Agnes.
Yep. Yep.
And this city was kind of devastated by this. And it seems to me like if there was some sort of a protection wall that could be erected of some way to at least shelter part of the city, has anything ever studied it along those lines?
We studied it on several of those jetty study projects that we did. We, meaning a good number of people, were involved in this, and this happened 2 or 3 times. And what we found was that you can't stop a flood, because a flood is nothing more than the river rises. And so it's going to rise no matter whether you have a jetty there or not. The only way you could avoid it is to have a total levee or a dike all the way around, which would completely strangle the waterfront. There'd be the end of boating and everything else. So the one thing that affects the city from time to time is just the rising of the water and just a straight flood. When you have a hurricane pushing water up the Chesapeake Bay at the same time you've got a flood coming down the river,
Yeah.
then you have basically a very unusual occurrence. And that's where the two waters are pushing against each other. And here we sit right in the middle of it. And that can always happen. It's rare, but it can happen. The third thing is just a wild river. And the jetty can certainly protect the city from a wild river, where we're not getting anything pushing back up from the Chesapeake Bay. It's just the river's coming down too strong and too fast. And that's when the Conewago Dam has no choice but to open up every one of its gates. And maybe the tide is coming in, so all that gate water is coming down, and it can't get out into the bay because the tide's coming up the bay. So it gets trapped. And, of course, the other problem is silt. And the silt situation is essentially created by the construction of the Conewago Dam. And that's why we have such a silt problem and a buildup of dredge soil everywhere that just chokes the marinas. And that same silt problem is what's wiped out the subaquatic vegetation, I understand, that used to just totally populate the flats and the mouth of the river. And that's why we had this massive duck population 150 years ago. This was one of the greatest places on the east coast for market hunting, because the place was just, wingtip to wingtip with ducks on the water, and because they had something to feed on. And that doesn't exist anymore to any extent. The dam caused a lot of havoc. But back to the jetty, that idea, it has a lot of pluses. It potentially has minuses. And I say potentially because I don't think that's been thoroughly studied. Such as what would the eddy currents do? What would the narrowing of the river do to the speed of the river? And how would that affect the Chesapeake Bay out beyond the mouth of the river? And stuff like that, just to throw that around. But I just want to say that that no jetty or any other construction that I can think of would stop just a straight flood. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have any questions regarding this chapter?
I have one more. On page 4, you're right under steep slopes.
Okay.
You say that 8% is not. If you go over at 8%, it's not preferred to have bike paths and walkways because the slope is too high. Is that?
Yes.
Okay, so we were talking also at another meeting about the possibility of doing walkways and pathways up Chapel Road, up that direction.
Mm-hmm.
That slope's way too high for that, so that was probably going to be something that's ruled out, I would assume, judging from this.
So the 8% is the standard, at least for ADA, and others where for accessibility, where it becomes easier to bike up or walk up, jog up, hike up. Once you start impacting that, they do have trails that it go up 8, 10, 12%, and then it go down. But on a normal, everyday traversing the landscape through biking or walking, exceeding 8% is strenuous, and its starts to get into limiting factors for physical conditions for people.
8% is the same as a handicap ramp, a 1 to 12 slope ratio.
I see what you're
8
saying.
times 12 is 96, so it's almost 100%. And 8% is just about a 12th of 100%.
Trying to get up with the
And so
wheelchair.
it's about roughly the same as a handicap ramp.
Yeah.
And so my question is, and I haven't looked into this in recent years because they're always messing with these regulations, but are you saying that that any trail that we create anywhere in Havre de Grace has got to meet a handicap standard?
To meet equitable, accessible standards, it's encouraged.
Is encouraged?
It is encouraged.
Okay, but what I'm saying is, can we have, let's just pick a number, can we have 20 miles of trails in Havre de Grace, of which 1 mile of those trails are not handicap accessible because of the terrain?
Yeah, you can certainly
Why can't we do that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And post it as such.
Yeah.
Okay. So I shouldn't think a steepness of a slope should really be an impediment to our trail design. I think that particularly when you take into consideration what the ground is made out of where you're cutting that trail. Is the ground subject to erosion, or is it the ground tight enough that it'll hold its shape and can be properly drained, and can trails be laid in switchbacks so that they're not steep? They can still climb a steep hill, but they just don't go straight up the hill, and all those things. I'm wondering if, after saying all that, what difference does it make what the steepness of the slope is to the comprehensive plan, particularly with regard to trails? What do you think, Chip? You're pretty good on trails.
If it's a recreational trail, and I'll use a One of my other geographical references, in Texas, they're very strict about recreational trails. They must meet ADA, and you have to go through a really rigorous variance process to build a recreational trail that does not meet ADA standards. That said, I think if you're talking about Chapel Road, if you're talking about other areas where basic health and safety are involved, and you don't have the area, basic sidewalks, I'm sure that, and I don't know what the law in Maryland is, but I'm sure there would be allowances, there should be allowances for providing safe access along a busy road so that people don't get run over. But certainly if let's take a project like the Legacies, which you refer to, but we've never seen, by the way, or other, like when you're master planning someplace like Scion Hill, that's an opportunity to make sure you have accessible trails throughout that system. Bully Rock doesn't have that, not close, but that would be an excellent opportunity to make sure you have accessible trails, and might have been part of an approved concept plan for that area. So where you have more of an open landscape to work with, certainly you should work towards that goal.
Sure. Well, I think the most glaring example of where ADA and real life come into conflict with each other is 155 Hill, the road, the state highway going up that hill. That is a considerably steeper slope than ADA allows. It desperately needs a sidewalk, at least on one side, because people are just going straight up the hill on the street, and I've seen people actually in a wheelchair going up that hill in the gutter with cars just whipping right past them because it's the only way they can get up there. And so I suppose that if we tried to press the state into putting in a sidewalk, that they would have to comply with ADA, and therefore they couldn't do it unless they acquired an awful lot of private land and had an awful lot of switchbacks. What in the world do you do in a situation like that? But that's our most glaring steep slope problem in Havre de Grace, is that hill and the amount of pedestrian use it gets.
Yeah, I would think that's a conversation to have with the State Department of Transportation.
But how do they solve the problem? And Chapel Road's got sections that are the same situation.
Mm-hmm.
It's particularly right by the cemetery.
Right. But people are walking up that road without any sidewalk whatsoever. So
Of course they are. They have to. They don't have a
it's
choice.
right. No, it's an untenable situation. So
And they walk.
I wouldn't consider that an impediment to putting in a sidewalk.
They walk with their back to the traffic because
That's
one
right.
side is easier than the other.
Yeah, they don't even walk facing traffic. It's terrible.
I think
Bad
that
situation.
if the city were to jump up and down about anything with the state of Maryland, it would be that hill.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's I'm on it all the time. Anyway, that's a little bit of a departure from.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I see you're thanking us. I see "thank you" written up there. We need to have a lot
Questions?
more commentary here.
More questions, comments,
Huh?
concerns?
I have another
Please,
one. I'm so
please.
sorry. It's on page 5, down at the very bottom. You have a wonderful sentence, which I just love, was just talking about my favorite view of this whole place is coming down the 155, looking out at the bay. It's my favorite. It chokes me up every time I do it. And every time I see it, I think, as you posted here, we have this beautiful view that's stunning. I love the use of that word, and I think it's important that we keep that word because it is really stunning. But I also wonder if there's any way that we can make that view a little bit nicer, because there's a few trees that are leaning over into the road, and some that are like could use some trimming up. But I think that's a city thing. I'm not sure how that works, but that view that's stunning. I would love to see something like how you addressed it here, I would love to see that protected. Like not, I don't know how you would do it, but not allow anything to encroach on that view, because it's very beautiful. And I don't know if there's opportunities for people to build things and do things that could disrupt that view. I have a question. That's a question to you.
Okay, that's a question? Yeah. I
Can
mean,
people do that?
we could certainly take that under consideration. I
Diane?
mean, identifying the scenic views within the
Diane
city.
is our font of
I love that. I love
Special
that you addressed
knowledge here.
that.
Fortunately, the private property owner, Ann Green, ended up preserving 50 acres along 155 Hill. That was partly, I believe, to preserve her views from the house, which is Zion Hill, which is a National Historic Landmark. But we all get the benefit of that as we come into Havre Grace. So that farm field off to the side is part of that. And then when you descend into town, you can get the views from Maryland 155 Hill and the Great Bay views. We don't have any methods for protecting vistas at this point. We certainly want to recognize that and have those pieces be considered as we do development review.
Yeah.
But there aren't any mechanisms at this point in time that protect views from as far as regulatory. The sensitive areas element in Maryland Department of Planning required that sort of conversation to happen in this plan. So that's why we're bringing it forward now.
So that field is in an agricultural trust, and that means it can't ever be touched. And the only thing that can happen in the future is eventually it turns back into a forest. There goes your view. And the other problem you're going to have is all the nice pretty trees that are out over the residential sections as you're coming off of the top of 155. Those trees are going to just keep getting bigger. And so it's almost nature is going to ruin your view.
Yeah.
Eventually, I think. And the only way you can keep the view is for them to keep on farming. So nothing grows in that field. That's
Anything else?
No.
Yeah,
all I got
so-
for that. Questions? Come on.
Well, I've got a few.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Figured you'd have some.
Okay. Let's start with the hard one right away, forest conservation. It was a little shocking to see that, a third of the forested area in town has been lost since 1986, notwithstanding a forest conservation law. And, I've seen so far in what we've done that sometimes things are a little bit loose in how those laws are interpreted, especially in the preservation of specimen trees. So I think that's something that has to be really vigilantly pursued going forward. It's one thing to have it in a comprehensive plan. It's even one thing to have it in an ordinance, but if it's not enforced, it doesn't mean a whole lot. And I'm just, we could do it another time. I'm just curious, how, for instance, at Bully Rock, a lot of that forest lost was at Bully Rock. There were some open fields that were ripe for redevelopment, even orchard areas, but there was some unfragmented forest in there where parcels W and P are, and I'd like to go back. I'd love to see go back and review how those were approved under the forest conservation law, what mitigation was provided for the loss of that forest. And we sometimes street trees are approved as mitigation for that, and street trees are lovely and they help habitat as well, but they don't substitute for unfragmented forest. One thing I love about coming up here, Mr. Chairman, is I return to the land of the wood thrush. And the wood thrush needs that unfragmented forest to survive. It's, the most beautiful sounding bird in the woods. So I think that's something that really needs vigilance. And but by the way, I thought you mentioned in your commentary that there is under the new legislation, there's a no net loss standard. I thought that was the standard under the existing legislation, and that the new legislation was there would be a net gain as a result. Are you able to clarify that at all?
I don't think neither one of us probably can speak to the forest conservation issues. So I'm not sure. And there is allowed a certain amount of clearing and then reforestation and afforestation, but I honestly can't say I can speak to that.
Okay.
To help you out with that.
All right, our state senator did a little robocall a couple of weeks ago, and she was particularly bragging on the new statute.
And it's my understanding that that is coming down from the state now as far as strengthening the existing forest conservation requirements, which end up trickling down to the municipalities. So I believe that language specifically is related to the new stuff that the state is strengthening currently.
All right, well, that's good. The more it can be strengthened, the better, because we've certainly had no net loss here so far in the last few years. All right.
Before you go on, Chip, I just want to reinforce something you were saying. Many of you know that I've been an extremely serious birder most of my adult life, and what Chip is saying is absolutely true. You can. It's not a question of just trees being trees. There's all kinds of forest and edge habitats, and each of those habitats support, each bird in particular and other land mammal species require very special habitats, and some species of birds and mammals love edge habitats, and that's mostly what we've got is what we call an edge habitat. That's where you got a small section of woods that are right up next to a field, or in a neighborhood you got one lot that's heavily wooded and the next one's not. And those edge habitats are wonderful for certain species such as the flycatchers and things like that. But like the wood thrush needs deep, quiet woods that's uninterrupted. They don't want to be in the woods and see a gap. They want to see nothing but woods around them. And there's a lot of species, a lot of bird species that depend on that. So whenever we start monkeying with the habitat by developing, we're basically changing the habitat, and we're discouraging some species, and we're inviting increase in others. That's really what happens. Spot on. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you. On wetlands, did I read that it's the Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA that defines wetlands, or does the state have its own definition of wetlands? And I say that because this past term, the United States Supreme Court limited the federal jurisdiction over wetlands, especially isolated wetlands. And I wonder if the state of Maryland, though, maintains jurisdiction over isolated wetlands where the federal government maybe does not anymore.
We'll have to get back to you on that one.
Okay. All right, no, it's definitely something good to clarify. And the 25-foot buffer, compared with most jurisdictions, is very small. 100 is typical. All right, the landscape conservation addition in here and the cultural landscape I really appreciate. It's a great addition. I noted the reference to the alley of boxwoods that looked at the mansion in Bully Rock, and it's a shame that that's going to be lost. Those are the kind of things, as we look at new landscapes like Scion Hill, there's a lot of particular, kind of intimate landscape features there that we should pay special attention to. Not just the grand vistas, but the little farm lane with the cypress tree that really add to the character, I think add to the value of any potential real estate development. And it's the kind of thing where you'd love to see landscape architects involved, not just engineers, in really laying these properties out. So And just to go back to the Blee Rock example, yes, they built the main parkway between the alley and the mansion, but what made it worse was that you could have still kept the vista, but they planted a street tree right in the middle of that vista. It's obvious nobody even looked at it. You know, nobody paid attention. Nobody walked the site. So again, walking the site is, by the way, very, very important. So you can see these things. Okay. And just, you know, and thank you, by the way, for putting all this together, Eric and Diane. I don't want to go any farther without saying that. All these sensitive features should be documented on, if they're not already, and if they're not part of the checklist, they should be documented on every site plan and subdivision application. We should not see a site plan or subdivision application without all these features mapped specifically on them. On floodplains, is there any update? Is FEMA doing an update on floodplain either in Maryland or in this area? I know they were doing a big one in Houston, and basically Houston, Harris County, they basically switched. They said they knew an update was coming. Of course, Houston, Harris County is very flood prone, but they went essentially to the 500-year floodplain without being told. You have to do it by FEMA. So
FEMA only regulates up to the 100-year floodplain.
right.
They encourage up to the 500-year because, you know, it's...
But I know they're going through a remapping exercise, which is actually even more relevant these days, and if we're allowed to use the term climate change here. And to Janice's point about the questioning the shoreline, questioning erosion, are we building into this resiliency for rising sea level, for climate change? I don't know if the state is addressing that broadly, or it's a little hard for us to do at a local level.
Sure. Thank you, Diane.
No problem. As far as the FEMA mapping, I can't answer that. You might have more direct
we have,
information.
I believe it's 2016 borough maps.
Yeah, I
We
think,
tend to redo them fairly
yes.
regularly. So I think we're in pretty decent shape as far as FEMA mapping, but I don't want to misspeak on that.
Okay,
We
you
can
might want
find-
to check on that. Yeah, when
find
the
more
next round of
information.
that is. Okay.
We, as far as the sea level rise and issues related to the shoreline and those types of things, that will be more heavily addressed in the water resources element. It's required under the state of Maryland to talk about sea level rise and climate
Okay.
change within
Okay.
that. And that's more, it will show up there, and that's where you'll see more of that.
Okay.
So,
Good.
yeah,
So
this
we've
is
got
a
that
little,
covered.
yeah, this does not cover that at all.
Okay.
Yep.
Sorry.
Any other parts to that question?
No, I was ready to move on to a slightly different topic. It's habitat areas. It's good. I understand the reason for not publishing certain sensitive habitats, but it's certainly something we should be aware of in reviewing any land use application. And I don't know how we necessarily do that without just looking at the broader.
Our best resource is the Merlin application that exists. It's a state of Maryland reference that goes into sensitive habitats in a very generalized way. Because of critical area mapping, for instance, we have some more direct information, for instance, like a heron rookery that exists on Tidings Island. So there are known habitats. And then a lot of areas like North Park are protected lands. That's constellation ownership within the city of Havre de Grace. That's parkland. And there's some habitat areas up there, but they're not going to be developed. So,
Okay.
but if there are specific habitats that I guess get identified, a lot of the Merlin, it's very generalized, but you'll see features, and we can certainly explore that as far as bringing those types of things, very generalized information to your attention.
Okay.
So, yep.
Okay, good. And steep slopes, how are they regulated in town currently? Is there a prohibition on, you said something about 25% slopes?
25% is the slope which the Forest Conservation Ordinance would come into effect, for they would be protected under the Forest Conservation Ordinance from development.
Okay. All right, because we had that with the Sign Hill Estates.
Yes,
And-
it gets a
which
little
backed
tricky. It
right up
wasn't
on that.
necessarily identified on the Forest Conservation Plan,
Right.
because it was sort of a combination of existing and then modified. It was the built environment,
Yeah.
so which caused the effect of the steep slope.
Right. Okay. And I've made this comment, in passing in times too. The topography we use here seems to be based on Harford County GIS mapping, which is, I think it's probably LIDAR mapping, which is kind of a broad topographic mapping. I don't think developers are going out and actually surveying in the field what the actual topography is, and they should be doing that, and especially in areas that are around sensitive features or steep slopes, so you have real grading plans with 2-foot contours on them. And that might be something can even be a modification to the checklist. And then I think the last thing, it's not mentioned here, and I don't know if this is the appropriate chapter to mention, but lighting and dark sky is also an important natural resource. And the city code increasingly over the years has been adding ordinances to prevent light pollution. And it's a bit kind of scattered throughout the code. The most recent edition of the site plan application regulations is most explicit about preventing pollution, night sky, requiring shielding of lighting. But it's not always enforced. It's still not being enforced at Bully Rock. We're still using the old BGE acorn lights, which just spread light everywhere. And these days, the issue is becoming more difficult because of the switch to LED lights, which
What lights?
LED
Oh, yeah.
lights, which on the surface is a good thing because they use less energy and they last longer,
And they're brighter.
but they're much brighter and they produce a tremendous amount of glare. And it's really at the very high on the blue light spectrum, which causes all kinds of issues to wildlife, to people, in addition to being most sensitive to the eye. And so the Bully Rock switched over to that. I noticed it right away. And now Parcel N, that development, the condos there, as soon as those streetlights went in, the people way across the pond from them just started complaining immediately. And it's something that, again, that needs to be enforced. And I think we even need to look further at the LED lights themselves. There's what they call a Kelvin range of brightness. And once you get over like 2000 Kelvin, then you're into the problematic zone. And where below that, it's a much warmer quality light. And, this is kind of all pretty new, kind of emerging stuff, well-intended. People are now realizing the consequences. But that's something we might want to take a harder look at or follow the trends and literature on that.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Place. That's something we can definitely explore adding into it. I know we have within the Sustainable Landscapes Ordinance and the Site Plan and Subdivision Ordinance, they do address that lighting, but it is a little bit fragmented, as you stated.
Yeah, and it's not to harp on it too much. It's not just people who live across from the lights, but if you look out onto the horizon, you look at my back deck and you look off to the right, you see glow a third of the way up the sky. And one of the things I really enjoyed about moving here is, having lived in both Houston and New York City, you get here, oh, I can see the stars, how amazing. And we are in that kind of sweet spot environmentally between the urban areas of Baltimore and Washington and Wilmington and Philadelphia, where the air is generally clearer anyway, and then you do see the night sky. So it's something to be treasured, and it can start slipping away very quickly. All right, those are my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Place.
Thank you, Eric, for all your hard work.
Thank you, Chip. Okay, anybody else would like to weigh in with anything tonight regarding this section? Yes.
Thank you, Chairman. Eric and Diane, thank you so much for your extensive work on this plan. And Eric, I appreciate you taking time to discuss in segments to clarify and make opening comments available. I know that there's still more work to do, and I look forward to looking at the action plans. I like the fact that some of the things are already happening. So part of our plan is developing as we see it happening here in Havre de Grace. So I like the fact that we have environmental knowledge on this planning commission to help bridge the gap between some of the things that we don't quite understand, as well as you two both going to other sources to get information. So I think that this plan, in this category, will definitely see a lot of stability with the knowledge that is here on the team, as well as with the developers and, the land conservation, et cetera. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tammy Schnees. We look forward to coordinating with you.
Thank you.
And as chair, I would like to also thank you both for the enormous amount of work you're putting into this. And great writing. It's, you might call this a kind of a beginning, but this looks like a finished product. Mm-hmm. It really looks great. It makes it so much easier for us to get through because it's so well written at this stage. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, if there's
Glad you
nothing
think so.
else, would you like to adjourn?
Do you have any?
I would ask you.
So soon?
Be looking for goals and actions on additional chapters. So I took notes tonight, but
Okay.
trying to think about, framing the goals and actions for this. Glad for your input.
There's also certain, we're not limited to the Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the land use models and guidelines, as were stated. The city can exercise discretion on identifying other areas of significant concern that are not included in those volumes. So if you want to talk about air quality, light pollution, air pollution, all that in addition, that certainly that we could put together sections specifically for that, if that's something that you would be interested in.
I know I'd be interested in that.
Oh, good. We got one. Okay.
Well, I am.
Okay, we got two. Okay. We do have a quorum here, so.
Well, just always remember the comprehensive plan is the beginning of such movements.
I think it would provide further enhancement to the comprehensive plan itself, because identifying it within the ordinances is one thing, for enforcement action and regulation, but putting it in the comprehensive plan really strengthens the overall idea and the principle and the values that the comprehensive plan wants to disseminate within the city as a whole.
Thank you. So, shall we adjourn?
Sure.
Thank you for your time tonight.
Well done.
Don't forget to